They thought it was a ghost, or worse, a mistake on their scanners. A single human destroyer, drifting at the edge of Imperial space, its engines running low, its hull scarred and asymmetrical, like it had survived something it shouldn't have. No fleet, no escorts, no retreat path, just one ship, and a decision that would ignite a war no empire could ever hope to win. The first empire to detect it was the Valkyrie Dominion, a civilization that measured power in fleet size and obedience in silence. Their border patrol flagged the ship within seconds, its signature unmistakably human. That alone raised irritation, not concern. Humanity was new, loud, reckless, a species that had risen too quickly and, in the eyes of older empires, without discipline. The Valkyrie commander, Overseer Threx, didn't even bother to stand when the report came in. He waved a claw dismissively and ordered a standard interception. One cruiser would be enough. It always was. The human ship did not respond to hails. It did not transmit identification. It did not power down. It simply continued forward, slowly, deliberately, as if it belonged there. Threx frowned slightly at that. Not fear, not yet, just irritation. He ordered a second hail, this time with authority codes embedded, the kind that lesser species scrambled to obey. Still nothing. The destroyer crossed the borderline. That was when irritation became offense. Weapons were primed. Target locks established. The Valkyrie cruiser moved to intercept, its sleek, perfect geometry casting a shadow over the scarred human vessel. Compared to the cruiser, the destroyer looked like debris held together by stubbornness and metal fatigue. Final warning, Threx commanded, his voice echoing across the bridge. Power down or be destroyed. For the first time, the human ship responded. A single transmission. No visuals. No diplomatic tone. Just a calm, almost conversational human voice. We're not here to ask. Silence fell across the Valkyrie bridge. Threx blinked once, processing the words. Not here to ask? It didn't make sense. That wasn't how smaller powers behaved. That wasn't how survival worked. Clarify your intent, he demanded. The response came instantly. We're here to prove a point. And then, the human ship accelerated. Not away, forward, directly toward the cruiser. Threx snapped upright, claws digging into the command rail. Intercept. Disable engines. Energy weapons fired, precise and overwhelming. Beams of controlled plasma struck the destroyer's hull with surgical accuracy. The ship should have been torn apart instantly. But it wasn't. Instead, something strange happened. The destroyer absorbed it. Not with shields. Valkyrie sensors confirmed there were none active. The energy simply dispersed across its surface, redirected through systems that made no immediate sense. The ship shuddered, but it did not slow. Impossible, one of the officers whispered. Then the destroyer fired. Not with elegance, not with precision, but with something far more terrifying. Velocity. A series of dense, high-speed projectiles tore from its hull, not guided by targeting computers, but launched in calculated spreads that forced the cruiser to react instead of think. The first volley missed. The second didn't. It struck the cruiser's forward arrays, not to destroy, but to blind. Before the Valkyrie could recalibrate, the human ship changed vectors in a way that defied predictive modeling. It wasn't random. It was chaotic with intent. Threx felt it then. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. And for a Valkyrie commander, that was worse. Reacquire target. Lock weapons, he barked. But the human destroyer was already inside their engagement envelope, too close for optimal firing solutions. It skimmed along the cruiser's flank, close enough that external cameras captured the damage in horrifying detail. Patched armor, exposed conduits, entire sections that looked rebuilt mid-battle. This wasn't a ship that avoided damage. This was a ship that survived it. The destroyer fired again, this time not at the cruiser's weapons, not at its engines, but at something far more specific. The command relay. The cruiser's coordination systems flickered for just 3 seconds. But in war, 3 seconds was an eternity. The destroyer used all of them. It rotated, engines flaring beyond safe limits, and unleashed a final barrage directly into the cruiser's core junction, an angle no standard doctrine would ever consider, because no sane ship would ever put itself in that position. The explosion wasn't immediate. It built, a cascading failure of systems, one feeding into another, until the Valkyrie cruiser, pride of the Dominion, tore itself apart from within. Silence followed. The destroyer drifted again, as if nothing had happened. Back on the Valkyrie command station, the bridge was frozen. No one spoke. No one moved. Because what they had just witnessed didn't fit into any known category of warfare. It wasn't superior firepower. It wasn't advanced technology. It was something else. Something unpredictable. Something that didn't follow rules. Threx stared at the tactical display, his mind racing through possibilities, searching for logic, for patterns, for anything that could explain what had just occurred. There was none, and that terrified him. Because if there was no pattern, there was no counter. The human ship transmitted again. This time, it wasn't directed at the cruiser. It was broadcast across every Valkyrie channel. "This is Human Destroyer Resolute," the voice said, calm and steady. "You've been operating under a false assumption." A pause, just long enough to make every listener lean in. That war has rules. The transmission ended. And for the first time in recorded Valkyrie history, an empire hesitated. Out there, at the edge of their territory, the single human destroyer turned slowly and began moving deeper into Imperial space. Not retreating, not hiding, advancing, as if daring the galaxy to stop it. And somewhere far beyond Valkyrie sensors, other human ships were already listening, already calculating, already moving. Because this had never been about one ship. This had been a signal, and the war it triggered had already begun. If you're listening to this on HFY Global Tales, just remember, sometimes the smallest spark doesn't start a fire. It starts something no one can ever put out. And if this moment gave you chills, make sure you hit like and subscribe, because what comes next only gets worse. The Valkyrie Dominion did not panic. Empires like theirs did not panic. They calculated, they assessed, and then they responded with overwhelming force. That was the doctrine that had ruled their expansion for centuries. One anomaly, no matter how strange, did not change that. But this was not behaving like an anomaly. Overseer Threx stood motionless at the center of the command platform, replaying the battle for the sixth time. Every angle, every movement, every impossible maneuver. The human destroyer hadn't just defeated a cruiser. It had dismantled it piece by piece, with an approach that ignored every known law of engagement. And now it was moving deeper into Valkyrie territory. Alone. That, more than anything, unsettled him. Fleet status. Threx demanded. 2 rapid response groups are inbound, an officer replied. 8 cruisers, 3 carriers, and escort wings. Estimated interception in 11 minutes. That was more like it. Proper response, proper scale, the kind of force that erased problems before they spread. And the human vessel? It has not altered course. Of course it hadn't. Threx narrowed his eyes. Open a channel. This time, there was no delay. The same human voice answered instantly, as if it had been waiting. You took your time. Threx ignored the tone. You have committed an act of war against the Valkyrie Dominion. Power down immediately and prepare to be boarded. This is your only chance for survival. A brief pause, then almost amused. You still think this is about survival? Threx's claws tightened. You destroyed a Valkyrie warship. You are alone, outnumbered, and deep inside our territory. There is no outcome here that benefits you. Incorrect. The response came without hesitation. There's exactly one. And what is that? Threx demanded. Another pause. Not uncertain. Measured. You learn. The transmission cut. Threx felt something shift in the room. Subtle, but real. His officers weren't just confused anymore. They were uneasy. That irritated him more than the human's words. Prepare full engagement protocols, he ordered. No hesitation. No containment strategies. We end this immediately. On the tactical display, the incoming fleet formations began to appear, clean, structured, perfectly synchronized. Valkyrie War doctrine at its finest, layered defenses, overlapping fields of fire, zero wasted motion. Against one damaged destroyer, it was absolute overkill. Good. Threx preferred certainty. Minutes later, the fleet arrived. The human destroyer didn't flee, didn't even change speed. It simply continued forward, straight into the tightening formation of ships that now surrounded it on all sides. Final opportunity, Threx transmitted. Surrender or you will be destroyed. For a moment, nothing. Then, the human voice returned. Softer this time. Almost disappointed. You're still trying to win the wrong way. Threx didn't respond. He gave the order. Fire. The fleet unleashed everything. Energy lances, missile swarms, containment fields, all converging on a single target. Space itself seemed to ignite as the human destroyer was swallowed in a storm of coordinated destruction. For 3 full seconds, it disappeared completely. No signal, no visual, nothing. And then, it came out the other side, burning, shattered, but still moving. How? Someone whispered. The destroyer's hull was torn open in multiple places, sections venting atmosphere, entire weapon arrays gone. By every metric, it should have been dead, but its engines roared, stronger than before. And then it did something that made no sense at all. It split its power. Instead of reinforcing defenses, instead of stabilizing damage, it diverted energy into acceleration. Tracking error, an officer shouted. It's exceeding predicted limits. Impossible, another snapped. No ship can maintain structural integrity at that velocity. The human ship didn't seem concerned with what was possible. It surged forward, not away from the fleet, but directly through it, straight into the center. Intercept vectors. Threx barked. Close formation. Too late. The destroyer didn't attack the strongest ships. It didn't target the carriers. It didn't even go for the command vessels. It went for the one thing Valkyrie doctrine considered untouchable: coordination. A burst of high-density projectiles tore through the space between ships, not aimed at hulls, but at the precise positions where targeting data synchronized between vessels. Invisible lines, critical connections. The fleet's formation flickered, just for a second. But that was enough, because Valkyrie ships relied on perfect timing, perfect alignment, perfect trust in shared systems. And the human destroyer had just broken all of it. Missiles lost guidance. Energy weapons overlapped inefficiently. Defensive fields interfered with one another. And suddenly, the most powerful fleet in the sector wasn't acting as one entity anymore. It was acting as many, confused, disconnected, vulnerable. Re-establish links. Threx roared. Manual targeting if necessary. But the human ship wasn't done. It weaved through the chaos it had created. Its movements erratic yet purposeful, striking where confusion was greatest, amplifying it, turning minor errors into catastrophic failures. A cruiser fired too early, its blast intersecting with a friendly escort. A carrier deployed fighters, only for them to collide with misaligned defensive grids. The battlefield unraveled, not because the human ship was stronger, but because it made everyone else weaker. Threx felt it now. Not just uncertainty, not just irritation, fear. Because this wasn't a fight, it was a lesson, and they were failing it. Focus fire, he shouted. Ignore formation, destroy the target. Finally, a clean shot. A concentrated beam struck the destroyer's engine core. For a moment, it looked like the end. The human ship faltered. Its speed dropped. Its trajectory wavered. And then, it transmitted one last message. You're getting closer. And the engines surged again. Overloaded. Unstable. Impossible. The destroyer didn't try to escape. It drove itself straight into the heart of the fleet and detonated. But not like a bomb. Not like a weapon. Like a calculated collapse. Every ounce of energy, every failing system, every overloaded component, released at once, in a controlled cascade that rippled through the already unstable formation. Ships too close to each other couldn't compensate. Defensive systems, already misaligned, amplified the blast instead of containing it. What should have been a localized explosion became something far worse. A chain reaction. By the time the light faded, half the Valkyrie fleet was gone. The rest were crippled, drifting, broken, silent. Threx stood frozen, staring at the aftermath. One ship, one damaged, outmatched, completely alone human destroyer, had just dismantled an entire fleet, not by overpowering it, but by turning it against itself. And as the last fragments of the battlefield settled into stillness, a realization began to spread, not just through the Valkyrie, but across every empire monitoring the encounter. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't desperation. This was design. The human ship hadn't been trying to survive. It had been trying to demonstrate. And far beyond the wreckage, new signals were beginning to appear. Multiple, approaching, because the first lesson had ended, and the next one was already on its way. The galaxy didn't react immediately. For a few long, suspended moments, it simply watched. Across dozens of empires, military observers, intelligence networks, and deep space monitoring arrays replayed the destruction of the Valkyrie fleet in stunned silence. The data didn't make sense. It refused to fit into any known model of engagement. One human destroyer had entered hostile territory alone and deliberately triggered the collapse of an entire fleet, not through superior firepower, not through advanced shielding, but by exploiting something no one had ever considered a weakness: order. In the aftermath, Valkyrie space fell eerily quiet. No triumphant broadcasts, no retaliatory strikes, just fragments of ships drifting where certainty used to exist. And then the second signal arrived. Contact. A neutral observer station whispered across the galactic relay network. Multiple human signatures detected. This time, no one dismissed it, because they weren't coming as a fleet. They weren't even coming together. They were scattered, appearing at different edges of Valkyrie territory, each one alone, each one following a slightly different trajectory. No formation, no symmetry, no pattern, at least none that anyone could understand. On what remained of the Valkyrie command structure, emergency leadership had already been established. Threx, one of the few survivors, stood once again before a tactical display, but this time, his posture was different. Less rigid, less certain. "How many?" he asked quietly. 7 confirmed destroyer-class vessels, an officer replied. "All human, all entering at separate vectors." "Fleet reinforcements?" "Delayed. Other empires are observing." Of course they were. They wanted to see if this was a fluke, a one-time anomaly, or something far worse. Threx stared at the display. 7 small ships, insignificant by every traditional measure. And yet, he could still see the ghost of the last battle burning behind his eyes. "They want us to respond," he said slowly. "Yes, Overseer. And if we do..." The officer hesitated. "They will teach us again." The room fell silent. That was the moment everything changed. Because, for the first time in Valkyrie history, an empire considered not fighting back. But pride was a powerful thing, and fear, when unspoken, often turned into anger. "Mobilize what remains," Threx ordered. "We will not be paralyzed by uncertainty." The command went out. Damaged ships were reactivated. Reserve fleets scrambled. Emergency doctrines were deployed, fragmented formations, independent targeting, reduced reliance on shared systems. They were adapting, learning, but they were still too slow, because the humans were already inside. The first of the 7 destroyers reached a Valkyrie supply corridor, a critical chain of transport vessels and resource carriers moving between core worlds. Lightly defended, efficient, predictable, the human ship didn't attack immediately. It matched velocity, slipped into the line. For nearly 3 minutes, it just moved with them, invisible in plain sight, then fired, not at the transports, at the escorts. Fast, brutal strikes that disabled weapons and engines without destroying the ships themselves. The escorts drifted, systems failing, unable to respond. And the transports? They panicked. Automated protocols triggered emergency maneuvers, each ship attempting to reroute, to escape, to avoid collision. But in doing so, they broke formation. And in that moment, they became exactly what the human ship needed: uncoordinated, vulnerable. The destroyer picked them apart one by one, not with overwhelming force, but with precise, disruptive strikes that caused cascading failures across the convoy. Fuel carriers ignited, cargo ships collided, navigation systems failed, and the entire supply corridor collapsed into chaos. By the time Valkyrie reinforcements arrived, there was nothing left to protect. And that was just one. Across the territory, the pattern repeated. Each human destroyer didn't seek battle. It created conditions where battle became unnecessary. One lured a patrol fleet into pursuing it through an asteroid field, then used controlled detonations to turn the environment itself into a weapon. Another transmitted false signals that caused Valkyrie ships to converge on the wrong coordinates, leaving key systems exposed. Another simply waited, positioned near a communication hub, silent and still, until Valkyrie forces diverted resources elsewhere. Then it struck, always at the right moment, always where it hurt the most, and never in a way that could be easily predicted. Back at command, Threx watched it unfold in real time. 7 ships, 7 separate engagements, no shared strategy, no visible coordination, and yet together they were dismantling an empire. "How are they doing this?" one of the officers asked, voice trembling. "There's no command signal, no unified doctrine. It's like they're all acting independently." Threx shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "they're not acting independently." He pointed at the display, at the chaos spreading across their territory. "They're thinking the same way." That was worse, because it meant this wasn't a tactic. It was a mindset, something ingrained, something every human commander understood without needing to be told. A way of war that didn't rely on structure, didn't depend on hierarchy, didn't require perfection, only initiative and the willingness to break everything else. The realization spread beyond Valkyrie space. Other empires began running simulations, recreating the battles, trying to find counters. But every time they adjusted one variable, the outcome changed in unpredictable ways. There was no single solution, no universal defense, because the humans weren't following a script. They were writing it as they went. And then came the message, not from one ship, from all 7. Broadcast simultaneously across every known channel. "This is Phase 1. The words echoed through command centers, war rooms, and imperial courts. "You've now seen how we fight." A pause, long enough to let the weight of that settle. "Phase 2 depends on what you do next." The transmissions ended. And for the second time since the first destroyer crossed the border, the galaxy hesitated, because now it understood something it hadn't before. This wasn't just a war. It was an invitation, a choice. And no matter what they decided, they had already lost control. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, more human ships were waiting. Not in formation, not in fleets, but scattered, patient, watching. Because the battle that shouldn't have happened was only the beginning. The galaxy did not erupt into war. It fractured. Where unity should have formed, hesitation took root. Where retaliation should have followed, silence spread instead. Every empire that had witnessed the Valkyrie collapse now faced the same impossible question. What do you do against an enemy that doesn't fight like an enemy? In the High Council of the Avran Collective, debate turned into open conflict. Some demanded immediate retaliation, total war, overwhelming force, annihilation before humanity could spread further. Others argued the opposite. Avoid engagement entirely, isolate human space, let them burn themselves out. Neither side had proof, only fear. They used 7 ships, one strategist said, voice tight with disbelief. 7 to cripple a major power. If they scale this, they won't, another snapped. They can't. That level of coordination. It wasn't coordination. A third interrupted quietly. That's the problem. Silence followed, because deep down, they all understood it. This wasn't a strategy you could map. It was a way of thinking. And it didn't scale in the way they expected. It adapted Across the galaxy, similar conversations unfolded. The Ketheri Empire began restructuring its fleets into isolated units, removing shared targeting systems. The Dravic hegemony doubled down on centralized command, believing tighter control would prevent chaos. The neutral systems started closing their borders. No one agreed on how to respond, but everyone agreed on one thing: humanity could no longer be ignored. Back in Velcari space, Overseer Threx stood at the edge of a shattered empire. Entire sectors had gone dark. Supply lines were broken. Communication networks were unstable at best, non-existent at worst. What remained of their fleets were scattered, disjointed, operating under hastily rewritten doctrines that no one fully trusted. And still no direct assault came. The human ships had vanished. Not retreated, not destroyed, just gone. That unsettled him more than anything. "They're waiting," Threx said. "For what?" an officer asked. He didn't answer immediately, because he didn't know, and that uncertainty was eating away at him. "They gave us a choice," he said finally. "Phase 2 depends on what we do next." The officer hesitated. "And what are we doing?" Threx looked at the tactical display, at the gaps where his empire used to be. Then he made a decision no Velcari commander had ever made before. Nothing. The word felt wrong, alien, but also necessary. We hold position. We stabilize. We do not engage unless directly attacked. The officer stared at him. "That's not." "I know what it's not," Threx cut in sharply. "But it's what we need." The order went out, and across Velcari space, the war paused. For exactly 6 hours. Then Phase 2 began. It didn't start with ships. It started with signals. Distress calls. Dozens of them. From deep within Velcari territory. Outposts reporting system failures. Colonies losing power. Defense grids shutting down without explanation. At first, it looked like sabotage. Internal failure. But the timing was too precise. The pattern too deliberate. "They're inside our networks," an analyst said, panic creeping into his voice. "We don't know how, but they're." The screen flickered. Every display across the command center went dark for a fraction of a second. When they came back online, there was a message. Not from a ship. Not from an identifiable source. Just text burned into every system. "You chose not to fight." A pause. Then, "Good." Threx felt a chill run through him. "Trace it," he ordered. "We can't," the analyst replied. "It's everywhere. Every relay, every node." Another flicker. Another line of text. "Now we show you the rest." And then the real damage began. Defense platforms powered down at random intervals, creating openings that didn't exist seconds before. Logistics systems rerouted critical supplies to empty coordinates. Automated shipyards began constructing incomplete vessels, wasting resources and time. Nothing catastrophic, nothing immediate, but everything disruptive, relentless, precise. "They're not trying to destroy us," the officer said slowly. Threx nodded. "They're trying to exhaust us." Because this wasn't war as the Velcari understood it. There were no front lines, no clear objectives, no decisive battles, just constant pressure, constant uncertainty, a slow unraveling of everything they relied on. And the worst part? They couldn't fight it. There was no target, no enemy to engage, just a presence embedded within their systems, their infrastructure, their very way of life. And it was spreading. Other empires began reporting similar anomalies. Minor at first, easily dismissed, until they weren't. Because once it started, it didn't stop. The Averin Collective lost control of a border station for 17 minutes. The Ketheri Empire experienced a full communications blackout across 3 sectors. The Dravic hegemony accidentally fired on one of its own fleets, all traced back to the same source. Or rather, the lack of one. Humanity wasn't just attacking ships anymore. They were attacking certainty. And across the galaxy, something unprecedented began to happen. Empires started reaching out to each other, not to coordinate an attack, but to compare notes, to understand, to survive. For the first time in centuries, rival powers began sharing information, Because the alternative was worse. Isolation. And that was exactly what the humans were exploiting. Back in the shadows between stars, a new human transmission quietly spread. This one not broadcast, but targeted. Delivered only to high-level command channels across multiple empires. A single line. You can still choose how this ends. No threats. No demands. Just a statement. And an implication that this wasn't the full extent of what humanity could do. Not even close. Threx stared at the message for a long time. Then slowly he spoke. They're not trying to win. The officer beside him frowned. Then what are they trying to do? Threx's voice was quiet, controlled. But beneath it, something else had taken root. They're trying to change the game. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of any empire sensors, human fleets were finally beginning to gather. Not in response to resistance. Not in reaction to threats. But because Phase 2 had gone exactly as planned. They called an emergency summit. Not a war council. Not an alliance. Something far more desperate. For the first time in recorded galactic history, rival empires, some of which had been at war for centuries, agreed to sit in the same space, share the same data, and speak without deception. Not because they trusted each other, but because they feared the same thing, humanity. The gathering took place in a neutral system, far from contested borders, under layers of security so extensive that even light itself was monitored. Representatives from the Avran Collective, the Ketheri Empire, the Dravik Hegemony, and what remained of the Velkari Dominion assembled, each bringing fragments of information and no clear answers. Overseer Threx stood among them, no longer the confident commander he had once been, but something sharper, more aware, more cautious, because he had seen it first. The others had only seen the aftermath. A massive holographic display filled the center of the chamber, projecting every known encounter with human forces. The lone destroyer, the 7-ship incursions, the system disruptions, each event layered on top of the next, forming a pattern that no one wanted to admit they still didn't understand. Begin analysis, the Avran representative ordered. At once, streams of data began flowing, battle logs, sensor recordings, tactical breakdowns. Advanced AI systems processed everything at speeds no organic mind could match, searching for weaknesses, for consistency, for anything that could be turned into a counter. Minutes passed. Then one of the analysts spoke. We've identified the problem. Every eye in the chamber turned. Humans do not follow doctrine. A ripple of irritation moved through the representatives. That's not analysis, a Ketheri warlord snapped. That's an observation. The analyst didn't flinch. No, they said calmly. It's the conclusion. The display shifted. Simulations appeared, hundreds of them, each recreating the same battles with slight variations. In every version, the empires adjusted their tactics, changed formations, altered responses. And in every version, they still lost. Because there is no fixed pattern to counter, the analyst continued. Human forces do not operate under a unified doctrine. They adapt in real time, often in ways that contradict their own previous actions. That's chaos, the Dravik representative growled. Yes, the analyst agreed. But it's controlled chaos. The words settled heavily in the room. Threx stepped forward. They don't break the rules, he said. They ignore them. The display shifted again, isolating key moments from each engagement. The lone destroyer accelerating into certain destruction instead of retreating. The 7 ships operating without visible coordination, yet achieving perfect disruption. The system-wide interference that targeted infrastructure instead of fleets. Each action, on its own, seemed irrational. Together, they formed something terrifying. They don't optimize for survival, Threx continued. They optimize for outcome. And the outcome, the Avran representative asked slowly, is what? Threx hesitated, because the answer was becoming clearer, and he didn't like it. Control, he said finally. Not over territory, not over resources. He looked around the chamber. Over how we think. Silence. Because that was it. That was the doctrine. Not a set of tactics. Not a formation. A principle. Humans weren't trying to outgun their enemies. They were trying to make their enemies irrelevant. The analyst brought up a final simulation, a worst-case scenario. All empires unite, they explained. Full military coordination, shared systems, maximum force deployment. The kind of response that had ended countless wars before. The simulation ran. At first, it looked promising. Unified fleets, perfect synchronization, overwhelming power. Then, the human response triggered. Not a direct attack, a disruption, minor at first, then escalating, until the very systems that held the alliance together began to fail. Communication delays, targeting mismatches, conflicting orders. And within minutes, the united force collapsed into disarray. Not destroyed, just ineffective. The simulation ended. The outcome displayed clearly. Total failure. They don't need to beat us, the analyst said quietly. They just need to make sure we can't function. The chamber erupted. This is unacceptable, the Dravik representative roared. There must be a counter. There is, Threk said. The room fell silent again. Stop playing their game. All eyes turned to him. They want us to react, he continued. To adapt. To chase them. To respond to every disruption, every anomaly. He gestured to the display. And every time we do, we lose. The Avran representative narrowed their eyes. So what do you suggest? Threx took a breath, then said the unthinkable. We don't fight them. Shock rippled through the chamber. That surrender, the Ketheri warlord snarled. No, Threx replied evenly. It's denial. He stepped closer to the center. We isolate. We reduce reliance on complex systems. We simplify. We become less vulnerable. Less advanced, someone muttered. Yes, Threx said. The word hung in the air like a fracture. Because no empire willingly stepped backward. Not in technology, not in strategy, not in pride. But humanity had found the flaw in all of it. Complexity, interdependence. The very things that made empires powerful also made them fragile. They're forcing us to choose, Threx said. Stay as we are and lose. Or change and survive. Another silence. Heavier this time. Because now, it wasn't just a tactical problem. It was existential. And then, a new signal cut through the chamber. Uninvited. Untraceable. Every screen flickered. Every system paused. And a familiar human voice filled the room. You're close. No one moved. No one spoke. We were wondering how long it would take. The voice was calm, almost approving. But you're still thinking too small. The display shifted on its own, overriding every security protocol. A map appeared, not of Valkyrie space, not of any single empire, but of the entire galaxy, and scattered across it, hundreds of faint signals. Human. Phase 3 is already in motion, the voice continued. A pause. Then, this is where it stops being a lesson. The map zoomed in, closer, closer, until the representatives could see it clearly. Human ships, everywhere, not in fleets, not in formations, but positioned with terrifying intent, waiting. Now, the voice said softly, it becomes irreversible. The transmission ended, and for the first time, no one in the chamber argued, because they all understood the same thing at once. This was never about one destroyer, or 7 ships, or even one empire. This was something much bigger, something already too far in motion to stop. The doctrine had been broken, and in its place, humanity had created something new. The galaxy didn't wait this time. It reacted, not with unity, but with urgency. Fleets were mobilized across every major empire, not in coordinated alliances, but in overlapping waves of defensive expansion. Borders hardened. Patrol routes doubled. Communication protocols were rewritten overnight. Every system that could be simplified was simplified. But it was already too late. Because Phase 3 didn't begin with an attack. It began with positioning. Across hundreds of star systems, human ships moved, not in straight lines, not toward obvious targets, but along paths that only made sense when viewed from a distance no empire had ever considered. They weren't advancing. They were arranging. Overseer Threx saw it first, not because he understood it, but because he had learned to stop looking for the obvious. Zoom out, he ordered. The tactical display expanded, pulling back from Valkyrie territory, then further, until multiple empires filled the projection. At first, it looked like noise, scattered human signatures, too distant from each other to matter. Then the pattern emerged. Not a formation, a shape, a slow, tightening lattice spreading across the galaxy. "What is that?" an officer whispered. Threx didn't answer immediately, because the realization came in pieces, each more unsettling than the last. "They're not targeting fleets," he said quietly. "They're targeting movement." That was when the first trap closed. A Dravik battle group, responding to a false incursion signal, jumped into a contested system, only to find nothing there. No enemy, no threat, just empty space. Then their navigation systems failed. Not completely, just enough. Coordinates shifted by fractions. Vectors misaligned. Return jumps slightly off. At first, it seemed like a glitch, until they tried to leave. "Jump drive error," the Dravik commander reported. "Recalculating." But every recalculation led to the same result. Drift. Not lost, but no longer where they thought they were. And then the human ship appeared. Just one. It didn't attack. It didn't even approach. It simply waited, watching, as the battle group struggled to correct itself. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late, because they weren't just misplaced. They were isolated, cut off from reinforcement vectors, trapped in a system that moments ago had meant nothing, and now meant everything. Back across the galaxy, similar reports began to flood in. Ketheri patrols unable to align their jump coordinates. Averin fleets arriving minutes too late or too early. Valkyrie reinforcements missing entire engagement zones by distances that shouldn't have been possible. At first, it looked like interference, then sabotage. But the truth was worse. "They're not disrupting our systems," Threx said, his voice low. "They're disrupting our understanding of space." Because the humans weren't jamming signals. They weren't hacking navigation. They were manipulating the conditions those systems relied on: gravitational fluctuations, microvariances in stellar radiation, tiny distortions that compounded over distance. Individually insignificant, collectively devastating. "They're reshaping the battlefield," an analyst whispered. "No," Threx corrected. "They're reshaping the map. And once the map couldn't be trusted, nothing could." The second trap closed less than an hour later. This time, it wasn't a fleet. It was an armada, a joint force, one of the first real attempts at cooperation between empires, moving to secure a key junction system. Hundreds of ships, multiple command structures, redundant systems designed specifically to counter human disruption. They arrived on time, in formation, ready. For a moment, it looked like progress. Then the human response began. Not from outside, from within. 3 human destroyers were already there. Not hidden, not cloaked, just ignored. Because when the armada had entered the system, they had been focused on each other, on maintaining coordination, on aligning protocols. And in that moment of internal complexity, they had overlooked the simplest thing: presence. The destroyers moved immediately, not attacking the armada, attacking the space between it. Precision strikes that forced slight repositioning, minor adjustments, nothing critical at first, but each adjustment created new variables, new misalignments, new stress on already fragile coordination. "Hold formation," one commander ordered. "Adjust vectors," another countered. Conflicting instructions, different doctrines, different priorities, and the humans amplified all of it. They didn't need to break the armada. They just needed to make it break itself. A carrier deployed fighters too early. A battleship adjusted its shielding too late. A communication relay prioritized the wrong signal. And suddenly, the armada wasn't unified anymore. It was divided, not by distance, by decision. The destroyers struck then, not hard, not decisively, but precisely, targeting the moments of confusion, turning hesitation into failure, failure into collapse. Within minutes, the largest coordinated force the galaxy had assembled was no longer coordinated. And once that happened, it was already over. Threx watched the battle unfold in silence. No anger, no disbelief, just recognition. "This is the trap," he said. An officer turned to him. "Which one?" "All of it." Because that was the truth no one wanted to face. There was no single battlefield, no single engagement, no single moment where the war could be won or lost. The trap wasn't a location. It was a condition, and the galaxy was already inside it. Every fleet movement, every response, every attempt to adapt only pulled them deeper. The human ships didn't need to chase their enemies. They just needed to shape the environment until every path led to failure. And now, with hundreds of ships in position across countless systems, the lattice was complete. A final transmission spread, not as a broadcast, but as a quiet insertion into command-level channels. No voice this time, just text. "You're starting to see it." A pause. Then, "There is no safe move." Across the galaxy, fleets hesitated. Commanders second-guessed their orders. Empires delayed their responses. And in that hesitation, the humans gained exactly what they wanted: control. Not through dominance, not through destruction, but through inevitability. Somewhere in the vast dark between stars, a cluster of human vessels finally gathered. Not many, not enough to be called a fleet, but enough to mark a shift. Because until now, they had been setting the stage. Now, they were ready to use it. The galaxy broke first, not in fire, not in destruction, but in decision. For the first time since humanity revealed itself, the empires stopped trying to understand and started trying to end it. Simultaneously, across every major power, the order went out. No more adaptation, no more hesitation. Total war. The Averin Collective authorized unrestricted deployment of their core fleets, ships that had not left their inner systems in centuries. The Ketheri Empire activated extinction-level weaponry, technologies once sealed behind doctrines that forbade their use. The Dravic hegemony centralized all command authority under a single war directive, eliminating internal conflict at the cost of flexibility. And the Velkari Dominion, they chose vengeance. Overseer Threx stood at the center of it all, watching as what remained of his empire committed everything it had left into one final offensive. Not a calculated response, not a measured strategy, a purge. If humanity wanted to break the rules of war, then the galaxy would erase the rules entirely. Target all known human positions, the command echoed across fleets. No containment, no restraint, no survivors. It was the most unified action the galaxy had taken, and it came far too late, because humanity didn't resist the escalation. They welcomed it. The first strike landed on a human-held relay system, a critical node identified during Phase 2. Hundreds of ships dropped into formation, weapons charged, synchronized down to the smallest fraction of time. This time, there would be no mistakes, no confusion, no delay. They fired. The system vanished. Completely. A perfect execution of overwhelming force. For a moment, there was relief. A belief, fragile, desperate, that maybe this could still be won. Then the second strike was ordered, and the third, and the fourth. Across the galaxy, human signals were targeted and destroyed in rapid succession. Every known position, every detected ship, every trace of presence erased with precision and brutality. It was working, or at least it looked like it was, until the reports started coming in. Target confirmed destroyed. Secondary confirmation negative. Signal reappearing. Impossible. We just. New signature detected. Same classification. At first, it seemed like an error. Sensor lag. False readings. But the pattern spread. Every system that had been cleared wasn't. Not entirely. Because humanity hadn't placed all its assets in one location, or even in predictable ones. They had layered them, overlapping presences, signals that mimic destruction, ships that move before impact, and In some cases, nothing at all. Just the illusion of a target. They're making us waste firepower, an Averin strategist said, voice tightening. No, Threx corrected, his gaze fixed on the data. They're making us commit, because every strike required energy, coordination, resources, and the more the empires pushed, the more they stretched themselves. The humans didn't counterattack immediately. They let it happen, watched, measured, waited, until the galaxy reached a single irreversible point. Overextension. That was when Phase 3 truly became war. Human ships began to move again. Not scattered this time. Not entirely. Small groups formed. 2, 3, sometimes 5 vessels, appearing at the edges of already exhausted fleets. Not where the empires were strongest. Where they were weakest. A Ketheri strike group, fresh from annihilating a human decoy network, found itself low on reserves when 3 destroyers slipped into its blind zone. They didn't engage directly. They targeted engines, mobility, escape. Within minutes, the group was stranded, and then abandoned, because command had already redirected resources elsewhere. A Dravik command fleet, centralized and powerful, received conflicting reports from multiple fronts, each demanding immediate attention. Their unified structure forced a single decision. They chose wrong. By the time they realized it, the human ships had already exploited the gap. Valkyrie remnants, driven by vengeance, pursued a cluster of human signals into deep space, ignoring warnings, ignoring anomalies. They never came back, because escalation, as it turned out, was exactly what humanity had been waiting for. They're accelerating us, Threx said, almost to himself. An officer looked at him. Accelerating us toward what? He didn't answer right away, because the truth was unfolding in real time. Every empire, in choosing total war, had abandoned the one thing that might have saved them, restraint. And, without it, they became predictable again. Not in tactics, in intent. The humans didn't need to guess what they would do next. They already knew. More strikes, more force, more commitment, until there was nothing left to commit. The realization hit all at once. They're not reacting to us, the officer said, voice barely above a whisper. They're guiding us. Threx nodded slowly, because that was it. From the very first destroyer, to the 7 ships, to the silent disruptions, to the lattice across space, every phase had led here, to a galaxy that had exhausted its own stability in an attempt to destroy something it couldn't understand. And now the humans would decide what came next. A final transmission began to spread. Not urgent, not forced, but deliberate, clear, calm, unavoidable. You chose escalation. The voice echoed across command channels, warships, and silent void between stars. So we adapted. A pause. Long enough for every listener to feel it. To be clear, the signal sharpened, focused. This isn't us fighting harder. And then, this is us fighting properly. Across the galaxy, human fleets, real fleets, began to emerge. Not scattered, not hidden, but revealed. Dozens of ships, positioned with precision that now made horrifying sense. They hadn't been absent. They had been waiting for this exact moment. When every empire was stretched thin, when every system was under strain, when every commander was reacting instead of thinking. The trap didn't close. It had already closed. This was just the moment everyone finally noticed. Threx stared at the expanding human formations, his mind no longer searching for counters, because there weren't any left, only consequences. And somewhere deep in the void, humanity made its next move, not as scattered sparks, not as hidden disruptors, but as something far more dangerous, a force that no longer needed to prove anything, only to finish what it had started. The collapse didn't look like defeat, at least not at first. There were no final stands, no last heroic formations, no single moment where the galaxy could point and say, that's when we lost. Instead, it came apart slowly, system by system, decision by decision. A Ketheri fleet arrived to reinforce a critical sector, only to find the battle already over. Not because the enemy had overwhelmed it, but because command had redirected the defending forces moments before impact. The sector wasn't lost in combat. It was abandoned by mistake. An Avern command node issued a retreat order to preserve its core fleets, but the signal arrived fragmented, interpreted differently across multiple units. Some withdrew, others advanced. A few held position. None of them survived. The Dravic hegemony, once so proud of its centralized command, became paralyzed under its own structure. Every decision required confirmation. Every response demanded alignment. And in a war that moved faster than thought, hesitation became extinction. Even the Velcari Dominion, hardened by the first blows, couldn't keep up. They had adapted, simplified, reduced their dependence on complex systems. But humanity had already moved past that, because the war had changed again. It wasn't about disruption anymore. It was about momentum. Human fleets, no longer hidden, no longer scattered, began advancing across key systems, not in overwhelming numbers, but in precise, deliberate strikes that built on everything that had come before. They didn't need to break defenses. They bypassed them. They didn't need to destroy fleets. They isolated them. They didn't need to win battles, because the galaxy had already lost the ability to fight one. Overseer Threx watched it unfold with a clarity that bordered on detachment. The fear was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't sharp anymore. It was heavy, inevitable. "They're not accelerating," he said quietly. An officer beside him looked up. "What?" "They're maintaining," because that was the final piece. Humans weren't rushing to finish the war. They were controlling its pace, keeping it just fast enough that no empire could recover, just slow enough that no one could see the end coming, until it was already there. Reports flooded in. Avern inner systems requesting emergency evacuation. Ketheri warlords declaring independent control after losing contact with Central Command. Dravic fleets going silent, not destroyed, just gone, their last coordinates leading into empty space. And through it all, human signals remained steady, consistent, calm, like a heartbeat the galaxy couldn't stop hearing. "They're everywhere," someone whispered. But that wasn't quite right. They weren't everywhere. They were exactly where they needed to be. The breaking point came not with a battle, but with a decision. The Avern Collective, one of the oldest and most stable powers in the galaxy, issued a directive. Not for war, for withdrawal. They began pulling back from contested systems, abandoning outer territories, consolidating around their core worlds. It was a logical move, a necessary one, and it triggered everything. Because the moment they stepped back, the space they left behind didn't become empty. It became human, not occupied, not claimed, just controlled. Supply routes rerouted through it. Signals passed through it. Movement depended on it. The galaxy didn't notice immediately, but it felt it. A shift, subtle, irreversible. "They're not conquering territory," Threx said, his voice barely audible. "They're redefining it, because ownership no longer mattered. Presence didn't matter. What mattered was influence. And humanity had woven itself into the structure of the galaxy so completely that removing it would mean collapsing everything else. The realization spread slowly, painfully. There would be no final victory, no reclaiming what was lost, because nothing had been taken. It had been replaced. The systems still existed. The empires still stood, but they no longer functioned the way they used to, and they never would again. A final report came in from the outer Velcari sectors. Not an attack, not a loss, a request. A human ship, small, unremarkable, had entered the system and transmitted a simple message. No threats, no demands, just coordinates, and a question. "Do you want stability?" The officer looked at Threx. "What do we do?" He didn't answer right away, because for the first time since this began, there was no immediate danger, no incoming fire, no collapsing systems, just a choice, and the weight of everything that had already happened. Threx closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Respond," he said. The officer hesitated. "With what?" Threx looked at the display, at what remained of his empire, of the galaxy, of the war that had never really been a war. And for the first time, he understood. Ask them, he said quietly, what it costs. Because that was the final truth. Humanity hadn't come to destroy. They had come to change. And now, the galaxy had to decide if it was willing to pay the price. Far beyond the fractured borders of collapsing empires, human fleets slowed, not stopping, not retreating, just easing, as if waiting for something, for someone, for an answer. And in the silence that followed, the war that no one could win reached the moment where it no longer needed to be fought. The answer did not come as a surrender. It came as a question, and that, more than anything else, told humanity they had won. Across the fractured remains of empires, responses began to form, not unified, not identical, but aligned in one critical way. They were no longer asking how to fight. They were asking how to continue. The Valkyrie Dominion sent the first reply. Overseer Threx stood alone in the command chamber, the weight of an entire civilization resting behind a single transmission. No advisors, no counsel, just him and the realization that everything they had been no longer applied. He activated the channel. This is Overseer Threx of the Valkyrie Dominion, he said, his voice steady despite the silence surrounding him. State your terms. For a moment, nothing. Then the human response came. Not delayed, not processed, immediate, as if it had been waiting. There are no terms. Threx frowned slightly. That is not how. That is how this works, the human voice interrupted, calm and unmistakably certain. We're not here to rule you. The words hung in the air, heavier than any threat. Then what are you here to do? Threx asked. A pause. Not for effect, for clarity. To remove the conditions that make wars like this possible. The display in front of Threx shifted. Not overridden this time. Invited. A map appeared, familiar but different. The same galaxy, the same systems, but layered with something new. Flow. Trade routes, communication pathways, movement corridors. All reorganized, all interconnected in ways that bypassed traditional borders, traditional control points, traditional power structures. You built empires on control, the voice continued. Centralized systems, predictable responses, structures that worked until someone stopped playing by your rules. Threx said nothing, because he had seen it, lived it, lost to it. We didn't break your empires, the voice said. We showed you where they break themselves. The map zoomed in, closer. Systems that had once been contested now linked seamlessly. Regions that had relied on strict control now flowing freely through new pathways. You can keep what you have, the voice said. Your worlds, your people, your identities. Another pause. But not the way you used to run them. That was the price. Not destruction, not submission. Change. Across the galaxy, other responses came in. The Averin Collective, after hours of internal conflict, accepted integration of human-designed network protocols. The Ketheri Empire resisted, then fractured, then partially complied. The Dravic hegemony didn't respond at all. Their silence said everything, because the choice wasn't really a choice. It was adaptation or irrelevance. Threx exhaled slowly. You're asking us to dismantle ourselves, he said. No, the human voice replied. We're asking you to stop depending on what makes you fragile. The difference was subtle, but it changed everything. Because for the first time, Threx didn't hear a demand. He heard an option, and options meant survival. He looked at the map again, at the new connections, the new structure, the unfamiliar stability. Then he made the decision. We accept. The words echoed farther than any weapon ever had, because they weren't just a response. They were a signal, and one by one, others followed. Not all, not immediately, but enough. Enough to shift the balance. Enough to make resistance unsustainable. Human fleets didn't advance after that. They didn't occupy. They didn't enforce. They simply remained. Present. Integrated. Watching. Not as conquerors. As something else. Something the galaxy had never experienced before. a force that didn't need to win battles, because it had already changed what winning meant. Time passed, not days, not weeks, but long enough for the first signs of something new to emerge. Trade resumed, not under Empire control, but through shared networks. Conflicts still happened, but smaller, contained, unable to escalate into something greater. Fleets still existed, but no longer as tools of domination, as safeguards, as balance. The galaxy didn't become peaceful, but it became different. And at the center of it all, humanity, not ruling, not leading, but shaping, ensuring that no system, no empire, no power could ever again become so rigid, so dependent, that it could be broken the way they all had been. Overseer Threx stood once more before a quiet command display, no longer filled with battle reports, but with something far less familiar: stability. He had expected resentment. He had expected resistance. But what he felt instead was understanding, not complete, not comfortable, but real, because he had seen what the alternative looked like, and he knew this was better. A final human transmission spread across open channels, not a command, not a warning, just a message. Clear, simple. This was never about winning a war. A pause. Then, it was about making sure no one ever fights it this way again. And for the first time since the lone destroyer crossed the border, the galaxy didn't hesitate. It listened. If you've made it this far on HFY Global Tales, it means you've just witnessed something rare. The moment humanity didn't just survive, it redefined everything. If this story made you think, drop a comment with your favorite moment and share it with someone who loves sci-fi like you do. Because out there, among the stars, the most dangerous species isn't the strongest. It's the one that changes the rules. And once that happens, there's no going back.